It was only a month ago, France's president was in Washington trying to convince Donald Trump to stay in the Iran nuclear deal. Now, the French president has landed in Russia, a long-scheduled meeting to discover the latest surprise out of Washington. After ripping up the Iran deal, Donald Trump sending a letter to Kim Jong-Un canceling his June 12th summit with the North Korean leader in Singapore. Will Trump's madman theory of bargaining prove his detractors wrong and reap results? Or should we brace ourselves for a bumpy ride as this old world order gets rocked to the core? North Korea, Iran, trade. Where do Trump's deeds and statements leave Macron and Europe? We're going to hear Macron's reaction and that of Vladimir Putin when they address reporters. The U.S. decision to walk away from the Iran deal and impose fresh sanctions on those that do business with Tehran, just one of the aspects they'll be talking about. Of course, North Korea, the other one. Today in the France 24 debate, after Iran, North Korea, joining us here from Washington, Kurt Mills, foreign affairs reporter at the National Interest, contributor to The Spectator in the UK. Thank you for being with us. Here in the studio, we're joined by France 24's Douglas Herbert, joining us as well. Anton Kozlov, associate professor at the American Graduate School, and journalist and commentator Dmitry Dekochko. How are you, sir?
Hello.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. No sooner had the North Korean vice foreign minister branded U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, quote, a political dummy, that the White House had downgraded Kim's status back to Rocket Man. In a letter to Kim, Donald Trump stating, you talk about your nuclear capabilities, but ours are massive and powerful, and I pray to God they will never have to be used. Trump following up those strong words when he spoke a short while ago at the White House.
I've spoken to General Mattis and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and our military, which is by far the most powerful anywhere in the world, that has been greatly enhanced recently, as you all know, is ready if necessary. Likewise, I have spoken to South Korea and Japan, and they are not only ready should foolish or reckless acts be taken by North Korea, but they are willing to shoulder much of the cost in operations if such an unfortunate situation is forced upon us.
Should we be worried, Anton Kozlov?
Well, if you ask me, I think Trump is bluffing, and so is Kim. I think they're both bluffing. We know that Trump, in fact, first Kim turned this crisis into something that Trump had to deal with directly. Trump agreed to negotiate. They both actually agreed. Now there is an issue of American and South Korean military exercise, and so there's some other issues, but I don't think it's something that is going to turn into a serious military confrontation of any sort.
All right, we've had those words so strong that we've had a Pentagon spokesperson coming out in the past hour, Dmitry Dekochko, saying there's no heightened state of vigilance. It's the normal state of vigilance that we maintain. Does that reassure you?
I also think there is a good part of bluff in that. I'm neither afraid by a conflict with North Korea. North Korea has destroyed three test polygons yesterday or today, nuclear. So it was what was asked by South Korea and Americans. Of course, you cannot treat a country like Trump has tried to do. I mean, you cannot dictate to a country which is very attached to its sovereignty. Just you have to destroy everything, otherwise we will have to apply to the Libyan scheme. Of course, North Korea couldn't accept that, and of course, but I don't think there is a conflict which is in preparation just right now.
North Korea couldn't accept that, but it's Donald Trump who's hit the pause button on this summit.
No, I'm not going to mince the words here. I believe that regardless of the spin to the contrary by the White House right now, I do believe that this is a fiasco for Donald Trump. And I believe that it is an inevitable outcome from a White House that essentially went into what is an extremely complicated bit of diplomacy, geopolitical diplomacy here, without, and I'm not overstating it by saying without a clue. When I say that, I mean it literally, because there are not to mention his top tier of advisors, which is now a very hawkish tier. John Bolton, National Security Advisor, Mike Pompeo is the new Secretary of State, very, very hawkish, belligerent in their foreign policy approach. But even below that, in the second tier of people within the State Department, whose ranks are still depleted after Rex Tillerson's reign, they don't really have any North Korea experts. The one guy who was considered their top closest advisor had left about a month, little over a month ago. He resigned. And the issue is that they were really relying and riding on and fueling their entire policy by bluster, but bluster coupled with ignorance of North Korea, of its motivations, of its leader psychology, as well as the past history of negotiations. It's a toxic combination, and I believe that the administration is trying to do what any administration in this situation would do right now. It's scrambling to save face and to pass the onus of the blame to the North Koreans.
All right, South Korea's president also weighing in, saying, I'm very perplexed. It's very regrettable that the North Korea-U.S. summit will not be held June 12th when it was scheduled to be held. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State earlier telling Congress it's not just about strong rhetoric out of Pyongyang.
I regret the statements that the North Koreans have made over the past few days, and the fact that we've not been able to conduct the preparation between our two teams that would be necessary to have a chance for a successful summit.
Anton Kozlov, could be North Korea's fault for not, answering back, getting the logistics ready. And there's this phrase at the end of that letter where Trump says, if you change your mind having to do with this most important summit, please do not hesitate to call or write.
Well, unfortunately, the President of the United States is not a very good either diplomat or political expert, negotiator, or whatever. I think it is in this sense, Kim is certainly a more capable person, it seems to me, than Donald Trump. Now, I think Kim is playing his game. He's not a democratically elected leader, so he doesn't have to answer to anyone. So he will do what he feels he should be doing, and it's up to the United States and to Trump and his advisors to find some sort of strategy to bring a consensual resolution to this crisis.
All right, let's cross now to Kurt Mills of the magazine The National Interest. Thanks for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Kurt, I have to tell you, the panel here in Paris has not been kind to Donald Trump after the announcement of the cancellation of that summit. It's appearing to them a little bit amateurish. Your thoughts?
Well, this is a president that flouts the advice of professional advisors and the foreign policy establishment. So I think we saw this morning as true to form. However, he thinks that this could potentially be a negotiating tactic. So you ask high, you sell low, you meet somewhere in the middle. This is vintage Trump. This is vintage Trump, the real estate wheeler dealer. I think what we see today should be no surprise.
Should be no surprise. So for you, it's part of, again, what Richard Nixon once called the madman theory of diplomacy, where you act a little bit crazily to catch your interlocutors off guard?
I think he's acting a little more than a little bit crazy, but yes, I think Trump is certainly the heir to Nixon in more ways than one, and I think he's certainly at least a fellow traveler of the so-called madmen theory.
So will it work?
I don't think this is scuttled. You have to realize that the channels between Washington and Pyongyang are remarkably small, tight, only a few people involved in them, and a lot of people are in the dark. Essentially, both sides had shown today that they are essentially not ready for this summit. You hear reports out of North Korea that Kim Jong-un is afraid to leave North Korea because his government will fall to some kind of coup, and Trump is plainly not ready to come to the table because the people in his White House don't agree with how to approach it. Trump, I think, wants a deal. I think his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is the closest ideologically to him. Also, Mr. Pompeo plainly has designs on higher office down the line and would also happily be the signatory to a major deal. But people like Vice President Pence, an ostensible rival, and National Security Advisor Bolton, the cabinet's uber hawk, are way more skittish on a deal. It's been unclear from the administration whether or not denuclearization is a red line. So would Trump accept any deal in the sense that, like, okay, we're going to get rid of half our stockpile, we're going to move there by 2030, or is complete and irrevocable denuclearization the only pretense for discussions? That's been unclear from the top four guys out of the White House.
I want to pick up, Doug, on something that Dmitry Dukochko said earlier, and that is a little bit the timeline of the past 24 hours, because you had on Wednesday, in the end, the invitation extended to these South Korean journalists to go and witness the dismantling of this nuclear site.
An already disused nuclear site that had not really been operational for quite a while, really.
Nonetheless, invited along for the show and tell session here. And then so it seemed as though
this is where you got it wrong.
that it was going, that things were going like it was back on the rails. And then the letter out of Washington, our sole correspondent saying he was a little perplexed by the.
I would take exception, I guess, Francois, to your use of "it seemed as if." That's where we fall into trouble here, because it seemed to whom. And I think this is where all these talks went off the rails, because, you know, the whole issue of denuclearization, everyone had a totally different worldview of what that meant. And I think that neither side was really reading the other. If either side was reading one side better, it was probably North Korea reading Trump a lot better than Trump was reading North Korea. Denuclearization, we've talked about this, we've reported this. Nuclear weapons, you don't have to be a nuclear scientist to know this. You don't even have to be a North Korea expert to know this. They are in the DNA of the North Korean regime. They are the raison d'etre of the North Korean regime. Kim Jong-un has not beaten around the bush on this. He has made it absolutely clear. It is in the North Korean revised constitution from 2012 that nuclear weapons are absolutely essential. Yes, would they like to one day denuclearize? Fine, but that's only at a point at which they have absolute security guarantees and they are convinced that there is no threat from hostile elements from without, i.e. the United States. So in a weird way, yes, he's a brutal, you could argue, murderous dictator of a very insular, erratic regime. That I'm not an apologist for Kim Jong-un, but he has, in many respects, been much more consistent in his approach here. He never, ever said that he was going to abandon his nuclear weapons. I think a lot of the error here was in this misinterpretation or wishful thinking, perhaps on the part of a White House that didn't really understand the motives of this regime.
All right. Again, we were mentioning the South Korean president saddened by what's happened. We've been seeing strong reactions on Capitol Hill from the opposition, the Democrats. Dmitry Dukochko, worldwide, the street credibility of Donald Trump after his announcement on the cancellation of this June 12th summit.
I think Iran is much worse for the credibility than North Korea. You know, I think really. That is not a surprise, in fact, because, yes, it is true, North Korea will not accept Trump to dictate her or to abandon the nuclear weapons, of course. And, you know, I'm not sure what the South Koreans think very deep inside. It's about the United States, of course, but historically it is also about Japan.
Right.
And when the United States are asking Japan to make rearmament, to go back to arms, and at the same time they ask Koreans to disarm. It is very contradictory for the Asian history. And Koreans, you know what is the relationship between Koreans and Japanese. It's a very difficult relationship. You must not play with that. So, of course, his credibility as a diplomat does not exist really. He's a good businessman. He's not a diplomat. We know that there is other tactics. He is a poker game.
So it won't change perception of Donald Trump when it comes to Korea. But you're saying the perception of Donald Trump has changed with Iran.
I'm sure it has, yes, even with Europe.
Dmitry Nikochko?
Well, first of all,
Sorry, Anton Kozlov, excuse me.
I don't think Donald Trump had any credibility to begin with. So therefore, he's got nothing really to lose in this sense. Now, I don't think this North Korean affair will hurt him that much, because basically what it was played on fear. Because when North Korea demonstrated its nuclear missile capabilities, everyone got scared that there's going to be a war, Guam, Japan, and so on and so forth. And then Trump started to negotiate, and there was even a talk about giving him a Nobel Prize for Peace, right? So now, no Nobel Prize for Peace. But what does he care? And what do we care about that? Not that much. I think Iran affair is certainly more serious, because what we're seeing here is a real geopolitical game, very serious games with a lot of unknown elements and a lot of players. And in this sense, whether he's going to be able to corner Iran, and with Iran, we're talking about, it's not just Iran, it's also about Russia, it's about Syria, it's about that part of the world, which does not agree, but it's also about Saudi Arabia, it's about the Sunni states of the Gulf.
Dollar, extra jurisdiction of the United States.
Whatever, the Pax Americana, so to say, which is collapsing for the past, I would say, since the war in Iraq.
Kurt Mills, the Pax Americana, a further sign of its collapsing, America's role as the world's, peacemaker, or if you will, the world's gendarme?
Well, I don't know if it's a collapse. You have to remember this is a White House that doesn't necessarily believe in that. We had a president who, as a candidate, vociferously criticized his Republican predecessor, George W. Bush, and also criticized his successor, Barack Obama, the safeguarder of the liberal international order. People in Trump's orbit, including former chief strategist Steve Bannon, plainly don't believe in the liberal international order. They see this as a sort of return to 19th century great power. But the idea that the president and America don't have any power or credibility, I think is, plainly not true. The world is obsessed with Trump. This country is obsessed with Trump. We hang on, for good or ill, what he's going to do in the morning. And so I think America still has a tremendous amount of say going forward, potentially indefinitely. What you would see, I just wanted to respond to one of the other panelists' points, is that I do agree that I think the Iran situation is potentially more dire than the North Korean situation. Regime change, or some sort of regime change operation in Tehran, is amply more likely than a corollary operation in Pyongyang, in my assessment.
All right, and when we come back here in the France 24 debate, we're going to see how the rest of the world is recalibrating, in particular to that decision by Donald Trump to walk away from the Iran deal, in particular as France's President Emmanuel Macron is in Saint Petersburg to meet Vladimir Putin. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom, and our top story, Donald Trump canceling the June 12th summit with North Korea, the U.S. citing inflammatory remarks out of Pyongyang and a lack of response from the North Koreans on logistics. The UN Secretary General has expressed his deep concern. The news breaks as Emmanuel Macron lands in Saint Petersburg. The French president meets with Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of an economic forum. A Dutch-led investigation directly blames a Russian brigade for the 2014 firing of an anti-aircraft missile that brought down Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 over eastern Ukraine. Final day of campaigning ahead of Ireland's referendum to remove its ban on abortion from the Constitution. Public opinion favors the change, but the lead is narrowing. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're speaking after Donald Trump's announcement that there won't be a June 12th summit in Singapore with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-Un. We're talking about in the company of Kurt Mills, foreign affairs reporter at the news magazine The National Interest, who is with us from Washington. Here in the studio, Anton Kozlov, who teaches at the American Graduate School, Dmitry Dikochko, journalist and commentator, and France 24's Douglas Herbert. Reactions coming in from not just the United States, but around, and from South Korea, of course, but from around the world. Reactions of alarm to the cancellation of that summit. Let's listen to the UN Secretary General speaking in Geneva earlier.
I am deeply concerned by the cancellation of the planned meeting in Singapore between the President of the United States and the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And I urge the parties to continue their dialogue, to find a path to the peaceful and verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Deep concern, Kurt Mills. Should the world worry?
I think we have to wait and see. The president, as recently as noon Eastern time here, says that a summit could be back on. And he even says in the letter that he seems to have personally written this morning, it's very much in his style and cadence, that, Kim Jong-un, please call me.
All right, so we shall see how it goes on that front. Now, just before the break, we heard Dmitry Dikochko say how canceling this North Korea summit won't change the face of the world. However, walking away from the Iran nuclear deal, that will have consequences. Right now, we have the French president, Anton Kozlov, who has landed in Saint Petersburg. I guess the first question, if you're Emmanuel Macron and you've landed for this long-scheduled meeting with Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of that economic forum taking place in the Russian president's hometown, you get the latest news out of Washington. How do you position your country in relations to, on the one hand, the U.S. and the other, Russia?
Well, I think in this particular case, France is an independent state. It's a sovereign state, all being part of the EU and of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Nevertheless, I think it has its own sort of independent political foreign policy position. Therefore, I think Macron will express his position, whatever it is. I think he'll probably won't be very happy about it, but I mean, I can't say, I don't know.
When you think back to that state visit and the big welcome Macron got in Washington, is it time for the French to recalibrate?
I don't think so. I think you shouldn't kind of be impressed with all those big welcomes, whether in Washington or in Moscow. What really is important is what they talk about behind the closed doors. I mean, all those kind of receptions and fireworks. It's not that important.
Douglas Herbert?
Well, look, Emmanuel Macron, I was in Washington watching his visit, that state visit to Donald Trump. He was Europe's envoy there. And what did he do? He came back empty-handed. He failed to persuade Donald Trump to stay in the nuclear deal, in the Iran nuclear deal, okay? He sort of put on the table a European sort of extension of the deal, make it bigger and broader. The question now is, can he get out of Putin sort of a commitment to remain in what's left of the Iran nuclear deal? It's a juggling act for Emmanuel Macron because, there are some people who fear that he's pivoting towards Russia and by extension towards China away from Trump. I think he's trying to maintain that balance. You speak to the people in the French presidency, their official line is they want to keep the lines of communication open to whichever leader we're talking about. They don't want to be partial to one side or the other. They want the president of France to be a man who could be the go-to leader that anyone can talk to, that any leader feels comfortable talking to. And the one thing perhaps you could say to his credit is so far he has managed the balancing act. It's getting trickier, but Donald Trump clearly still is fond of Emmanuel Macron for all of their differences. And Vladimir Putin, while they might have a slightly frostier relationship, and Macron has been very sharp with him on a lot of issues and has not pulled his punches when he's disagreed with Putin. It's on things like meddling, media campaigns, smears against the French elections last year. all of that. I do think that in this case, there's still something salvageable, and I think that these two men, even though they know they disagree, still feel like they can talk like professionals, can talk like two leaders, grown-ups, so to speak, and can find some common ground, not least of which on Iran.
Dmitry Dikochko?
Well, I think, of course, it's very good. Macron has gone to Moscow. Now, will there be results? And will he come back from Trump with empty-handed? That is the question, in fact. About Iran, he may not worry, because, of course, it's in the interest of Russia to stay in the agreement. The point is that you were saying about a collapse of diplomacy of United States. I don't think there is a collapse. They are the strongest in the world. They are trying to get this American empire. They dictate everything to European states, and unhappily, we are not as sovereign as we were during de Gaulle. And maybe, that is my hope, in fact, Macron will try to show some ambition of sovereignty, and the Iranian factor may help him. I think they will discuss with Putin about the possibility of avoiding the American extra jurisdictions against financial operations
we've had
of the French companies and European companies.
Because we had the the U.S. Treasury Secretary this Thursday announcing new sanctions against Iran. In particular, he said targeting the aviation sector. Effectively, because the world does business in U.S. dollars, you have to play by American rules.
And petrol and gas, too. And that is our problem, because they are also threatening the way the gas of the north,
The Northern Stream.
The Nord Stream.
the Nord Stream 2. That is a very big problem for us and for Germany. Merkel has not agreed with Americans asking to abandon the Nord Stream 2. I hope France will not abandon too, but we don't know exactly what is the capacity of France to resist Americans' dictate.
Yeah.
That is the first point. Another point, I think they will discuss also about Ukraine, because France is with Germany and Russia in the Minsk agreement. And it is not
try to
applied.
enforce to a ceasefire, which isn't working.
It is not applied because of Kiev. And they know it. Both of them know that.
Just one clarification. I'm referring back to the Iran issue between France and Russia. It is true that France, Germany, and Russia all want to keep the deal, to salvage a deal with Iran. But there is a distinction to be made. Russia has said it likes the deal. It likes the existing deal. Russia has never been on board with this European proposal to broaden the deal to include things like regional security matters, ballistic missiles, other nuclear issues. Russia wants to stay in the deal as it was. This is a possible area of divergence, and it's going to be something that they're going to have to find a way to bridge.
It's true, but
Yeah,
Macron
Russia's
has
not
said
concerned
it will
about-
be after
Kurt Mills.
the end of this agreement.
Yeah.
So
Russia is not concerned about Iranian regional hegemony. They intervened in Syria to ensure that. That's a clear area of divergence between Macron and Putin. It's been an absolutely near apocalyptic month for Macron. Macron comes to Washington in late April, and you can say that pageantry and ceremony doesn't matter, but it does matter to the President of the United States, Donald Trump. He thinks a lot of Macron, but he's been a little concerned and sour to learn that they don't really agree on that much. Macron is a neoliberal who wants to underpin the status quo, maybe hem and cut certain things here and there, but more or less wants to preserve it. Donald Trump has a more radical agenda, and the two of them have diverged on this. I think what you're seeing with France generally is a return to its sort of Cold War posture, even a Gaullist posture of a third way between Russia and the United States. But in trying to do that, in trying to preserve the status quo, but also ameliorate the concerns out of Washington, it might find itself isolated, which is the opposite of what it intended to do.
It might find itself isolated. You've just been listening to our panel discussion here, Kurt Mills. Nobody on this side of the Atlantic is happy about the U.S. Tearing up the deal. There's no backlash for Washington whatsoever from ignoring the rest of the world. Again, because we trade in U.S. dollars, we have to just play by American rules.
There's certainly a backlash. The European leaders don't like Donald Trump and would happily see him head for the exits in 2020 or if not sooner. But until then, if Donald Trump wants to use American power and American metal to squeeze the Europeans, I'm not convinced, based on what we're hearing there and in European capitals, that there's all that much they can do to stop them unless the Europeans want to pivot into a Russian or Chinese axis, which for people like Macron and even Merkel, I think seems beyond the pale.
So there'll be no long-term consequences for the United States?
If the United States wants to engage in regime change in Iran or in North Korea, there'll obviously be calamitous long-term consequences. But Trump merely flouting the supposed norms of a liberal international order that's plainly cratering, I think there might be a little bit of a overreaction to the immediate consequences of that. We could be talking on Saturday morning about a summit that's back on. So all I'm urging is caution. This is what Trump does. Trump loves having a minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour news cycle that is about him, and he's achieved that.
He has achieved it indeed, Anton Kozlov.
Yes, he certainly he did, and he does achieve that. But I would like to say, when I mentioned the end of and the sort of the
Pax
disintegration of Pax Americana, I didn't talk about American diplomacy per se. What I meant is that the global order guaranteed by the United States after 1945 and up to probably early 1990s is disintegrating.
Because Kurt just said, if he sticks to just if Donald Trump just sticks to walking away from the Iran deal, there'll be no consequences for the U.S. Obviously, there could be an overreach if he goes further. Right. But do you agree with that?
No. Well, first of all, I have to define what do we mean by consequences. What kind of consequences we're talking about? Are we talking about international isolation, or what are those consequences? That's to begin with. Second of all, I think it's just this walking away from the Iran deal, just part of many different things that Trump does. For example, this clear and apparent attack on the World Trade Organization, right, which is going to, I don't know whether it will survive, but certainly we do have a situation when from first, we've been moving towards large international agreements, organizations, and different structures that would make the world a safer and better working place, or at least in theory. Now we're going towards sort of this chaotic political situation of the balance of power situation of the 19th century, right?
And
that's what President Trump wants. That's what President Trump wants.
That's what he wants, Kurt Mills. And let me ask you on that point, because we've talked about North Korea, we've talked about Iran, we haven't talked about the brewing trade war, which is also a trade war with Europe, where first there were the steel and aluminum tariffs that are being threatened, and now one on imported cars. Will that have consequences on the transatlantic relationship?
Look, this is not the president that the Europeans would have selected, or at least the European elites would have selected. But President Trump and some of the intellectual advisors around him see a sea change in world politics, and they don't favor the U.S. underpinning this liberal international order. I think he's been pretty plain about it. He called NATO obsolete. Now, look, he has official statements to the contrary, and his White House is populated by a lot of conventional Republicans who don't believe in any of this sort of more radical stuff. But the president is a fellow traveler of the sort of Steve Bannon, Pat Buchanan type arrangement of where the world should be going. So if the president can squeeze the Europeans for better deals on cars there, or squeeze the Chinese for better deals for American steels here, he's going to do that. And that's the way he sees American power operating in the 21st century going forward. And I think a lot of Americans agree with him.
Douglas Herbert?
And And there's also a trend of a growing number of Europeans. I mean, we keep saying
Absolutely.
Europeans, and I think Kurt's aware of this as well. We can't speak any longer of Europeans as a monolithic bloc. I mean, we never were able to really do that. But now more than ever, there are disturbing, depending on where you stand, disturbing trends. It started, right? You always think of the periphery of Europe, right? You think the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland. They've been bucking the establishment. They've been the anti-Euro forces. But look, we just mentioned Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon was in Prague this week, stirring up, well, I'll say it, stirring up trouble among certain the radical fringe, which isn't as fringy anymore as it used to be. It's becoming more mainstream by the day, it seems. And he's heading, I think, to Italy.
Which is
Which
is a bigger problem? On the one hand,
we're seeing
for
a
Europe,
Trumpification of Europe a little bit.
All right. So
parts of Europe.
which is a bigger problem for Europe? Donald Trump on the one hand, or on the other hand, the opponent of Emmanuel Macron in the presidential election, Marine Le Pen, who got support from Russia, Matteo Salvini in Italy, who's very close to the Kremlin and wants an end to Russian sanctions.
Absolutely, wants to soften those sanctions, wants to be a friend of Vladimir Putin.
Which is a bigger problem for the EU?
For the EU right now, I would say on its home front, because the U.S. is the U.S., Donald Trump's policies probably still have a bigger impact immediately geopolitically on a lot of stuff that goes on in Europe, whether Europeans like to admit that or not. But from a purely domestic perspective, it's getting harder and harder by the day to ignore what has become, when you have a founding member of the European Union suddenly in the grips of a government. In the grips, that's obviously a biased term, but I'll say in the grips of a government of populists and nationalists, I think that's not just one red flag going up, that's several red flags going up. We don't know where things are going. And we sort of, I think it's overly simplistic to say, well, the Europeans on one side and the U.S. on the other side with Trump. The Europeans, there's a mix in there that are very much behind Trump's policies, that are cheering him on. We've heard Nigel Farage, we've heard Marine Le Pen, we've heard Steve Bannon now here in Europe, and now we have the Salvinis in Italy.
Who's coming up with those populists more? Is it the Trump side or is it the Putin side?
Well, I think Trump, he probably, he's a very pragmatic, but I think I don't know if he's as cynical as Putin is. Putin basically using all these movements in Europe and in the United States to advance Moscow's agenda. Trump, he's not too educated and too well-read or well-informed to be as cynical as I think Putin and people around him are.
Dmitry Dikochko?
No, I think your correspondent in Washington is right. Americans have their policy. They want America first. Well, it's legitimate, in fact. We have to think about Europe, about France, and we have to think France first. Europe first, and our interest is to play, of course, with Russians also, with America, but with Russians, and not to have our policy dictated by American interests.
A year ago, when Emmanuel Macron welcomed Vladimir Putin to Versailles, he lectured him on fake news, on meddling in the French presidential election campaign.
That is clearly propaganda, and that was just effect of announcement. RT and Sputnik is nothing compared to the Western medias, and everybody knows that. And I think Macron even knows also. And if Putin was not polite as he is, he could say what the Western media are doing in Russia against Russia, and they are all allowed in Russia, which is not the case of Russian media in Ukraine, for instance, or in the Baltic states, where they are forbidden.
I think you cannot compare the Voice of America or BBC.
You can see any BBC, CNN,
The
Voice
standards
of America,
of journalism
Roger Svoboda,
with the Russia Today or Sputnik, they are below the lowest standards that possibly imagine.
I don't think so.
I think it is.
I can.
We're getting into a
I
slightly
can give
different
you
debate
many
here,
examples
right?
of the Western press, which
The Western
is
press
in
certainly
complete
does have
Russophobia.
its-
Complete Russophobia with.
But we're not talking about Russophobia. We're talking about manipulation. We're talking about
Let's
fake news.
compare apples to apples. If we're going to compare apples to apples, and let's have Sputnik and RT on one side, I would put Fox News on the other side. Fox News, if I had to define its mission,
not only Fox News.
mission is to not to get Republicans elected, but to keep Republicans in power. I would say, whereas you can't make the same case of the liberal media where they're not trying to get Democrats elected.
The media do not do the election.
I don't know. We could that
Happily.
argument could go on a long time, but let me just ask you, Kurt Mills, just to end this all. You mentioned Donald Trump, what he does know from when he worked in reality television. You were mentioning it yourself, keeping us in suspense and understanding, how to entertain as he moves his narrative along. Again, is he ahead of the game when you look at Europe?
I think that going back to Macron is clearly a chameleon. And that is why he has moved since his election victory towards more of this populist nationalist front. And so that's why he's cultivated a relationship with Trump, and that's why he's probably terrified of what's transpiring in Italy. To an extent, you can call the president not terribly intellectual, but he has been ahead of the game. He has been the tip of the spear for the last 3 years of what has occurred globally and in the United States. And I don't see that changing as long as he occupies 1600 Penn.
All right, I want to thank you for joining us. Kurt Mills in Washington. Here in the studio, Dmitry Dikochko, Anton Kozlov, Douglas Herbert. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Charlie James.
Hello. Bringing you some reactions, except it looks like they have pulled up the wrong one here, so I'm not sure.
What have you got? Let me see.
Bring this to you. It looks like it's the French. It looks like it's all the French reactions. So we're having a little technical problem, but I can give you just a synopsis of what the American political reactions have been here, very much falling along lines with Democrats and Republicans, not entirely, but Chuck Schumer, the Senate minority leader, saying that this shows that Donald Trump was underprepared to deal with North Korea, and the Republicans on the other side saying that this was the right move for Donald Trump to stand up to Kim Jong-Un in this way and bring it back. One thing that people are making fun of a little bit, I'm not sure if you've seen, are those commemorative coins that
that's right.
that have been produced. I don't know if we can bring those pictures up.
Coins.
But they did bring.
Selling for a lot of money
now. They're going to be selling for a lot of money. Yeah, those are going to be collectors.
Right. So actually, the White House gift shop website crashed today as people were rushing to try to find these coins and buy them, unsure whether the value of those will be going up or down. But that's another thing that people are talking about a lot online right now.
All right, those commemorative coins, we'll be seeing more about them. Many thanks for that, Charlie James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.